Hello and welcome back to SIG Mechanics. I'm Edmund. Now, before I get started, I have a bit of news to share. I'll start by saying just how honored I am that this channel has grown as quickly as it has within such a short period of time. And today I have the pleasure of introducing to you SIG Mechanics' partnership with MD Charlton. This is big news for subscribers because MD Charlton is the one and only warranty partner certified with Sig Sauer USA north of the border, and they have graciously agreed to give SIG Mechanics access to various Sig Sauer products and parts to allow this channel the ability to give viewers unabridged and unbiased reviews, information, testing, and more. So if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel because there are great things to come. And I'd like to personally thank MD Charlton and welcome them to SIG Mechanics. Now, this video is one that I've wanted to do for a while because the topic comes up so much in conversations regarding the P320 and even still comes up in the media quite often. Recently, I was able to get my hands on this here, a pre-upgrade FCU, and for those of you who are newer to the P320 platform, I think you'll appreciate this information as it's now less and less common to find a P320 that has not undergone the voluntary upgrade procedure. And it's becoming rarer to see this up close and personal. And for those of you who have been around for a while, you've likely seen and heard much of the debate about the pre-upgrade drop safety some years back. And there still seems to be many people who are unaware of what Sig Sauer accomplished with the upgrade program. However, this video is not going to be about my opinion on the upgrade program or the P320's overall safety, but I will be giving you a deep and up-close understanding of how the pre-upgrade P320 operates, what parts are different from the modern upgraded models, and exactly what Sig Sauer's upgrade program did to the gun's mechanical operation. So we will be comparing the non-upgraded P320 to the upgraded one, and we'll also be tearing it down to inspect it part for part. Let's begin. As always, a quick disclaimer, I'm not a gunsmith or an armorer, and doing any kind of modification or work on your pistol may result in malfunction or injury. So if you're unsure about what you're doing, please contact a professional and have them either do the work for you or at least provide an extra level of guidance as you proceed. This is a pre-upgrade FCU, and if you're only familiar with the upgraded models, this one's rather curious because prior to the upgrade program, this pistol mechanically functioned different. When a user pulls the trigger on the pre-upgrade pistol, the initial functions are basically the same as post-upgrade. The trigger moves back, trigger bar moves forward, striker's safety lever moves up, the leg at the back of the trigger bar engages the SEAR begins to move down, eventually the striker will be released and the gun will fire. But then you release the trigger and something different happens. It resets. And this is the main mechanical and functional difference between pre and post-upgrade P320s. Whereas on the pre-upgrade, the trigger pull and release equates to a fire and a reset. The upgraded P320 only makes the SEAR move down when you pull the trigger. Releasing the trigger doesn't actually reset the trigger. And that's done by a separate part called the trigger bar disconnector, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So the question I asked was, if the pre-upgrade P320 lacked a separate disconnector to physically disconnect the trigger, how is it that the pistol resets? And it does so by having the disconnector engineered directly into the SEAR housing. Let's take a closer look. Here I've removed the SEAR housing and the trigger bar from the pre-upgrade FCU. And the disconnecting of the trigger bar occurs due to this ramp machined into the SEAR housing. And on the trigger bar, this face or this plane that's machined into the trigger bar's leg. And as you know, the trigger bar leg sits inside the SEAR housing and engages with the SEAR as a user pulls the trigger so that the SEAR goes down for the striker to be released. But on the pre-upgrade SEAR housing, this ramp also causes the trigger bar to rise as the trigger bar moves forward. This action is what disengages the trigger bar from the SEAR. Now to reset, a user releases the trigger bar will sit on the SEAR, and then the tension of the springs of the trigger bar will pull the trigger bar back, pushing the trigger bar behind the SEAR again and thus resetting the trigger. Now today, this mechanism or this mechanical operation no longer exists on the P320 because of one main critical part change, the disconnector. Let's take a look at that. To give a proper comparison of pre and post upgrade, the pre-upgrade model did not have a mechanical disconnector. Therefore, the gun's trigger engages the SEAR on every trigger pull, regardless of the slide's position. Now, once you understand this, the positive change made by the upgrade program becomes vastly amplified, especially when we explore the finite details of the disconnector. For those that may not know yet, the disconnector was introduced to the consumer P320 as a mechanism that serves two functions: to reset the trigger after the firearm was discharged or manually manipulated, and to provide a method for the firearm to reliably measure the slide's position relative to the disconnector itself. In other words, the disconnector on the upgraded P320 prevents the striker from operation if the slide is out of battery. But the disconnector itself doesn't complete the operation, so SIG Sauer had to also alter the slide itself. Let's take a quick look. Here we have the pre-upgraded slide on the right and the upgraded one on the left. And for the disconnector to function correctly and reliably, SIG had to mark a location along the body of the slide to indicate to the disconnector that the slide is in fact in battery. This was accomplished by adding this cutout or notch into the slide's underbody, located just left of where the striker would go. Let's take a look at how the notch and disconnector function as part of the fire control unit. On the upgraded P320, the notch machined into the underside of the slide provides a sort of housing for the disconnector. Whenever the disconnector head is inside of this notch, the trigger bar will then be positioned behind the SEAR, ready to engage with the SEAR if the user decides to pull the trigger. However, if the slide position moves out of battery or if the gun's been fired, then the disconnector is pushed down by the slide body, thus preventing engagement between the trigger bar and SEAR. So that's how the disconnector serves the out of battery safety. Let's see how it serves on reset. When the gun's been fired and the user holds down the trigger, the disconnector instantly forces the trigger bar down and on top of the SEAR before returning to the notch. So now, as the user releases the trigger bar spring will guide the trigger bar back behind the SEAR, and the gun is ready for its next discharge. Moving on, let's take a closer look at the striker safety lever. And side by side, we can see that the upgraded safety lever has gone through an obvious design change. Let's take a look. The pre-upgrade striker safety lever lacked the jagged protrusion of this metal tab found on the back end of the upgraded one. And it's this metal tab that allows the new safety lever design to function without its own spring. And similar to the trigger bar disconnect, the engineers at SIG seem to utilize the tension of the trigger bar's spring to make this all happen. So here I have installed the SEAR housings on both the upgraded and pre-upgraded FCUs, and I've removed all the internal components with the exception of the safety levers themselves. And on the pre-upgrade, I did not install the spring because the SEAR and the full assembly is what holds the spring in place. Now let's take a look at what happens when you're using the upgraded version of the striker safety lever. So if you look underneath, you'll note that the this part here, this portion here of the safety lever interacts with the front of the trigger bar, and then you have that metal tab that interacts at the back. And what they did is they wrapped the safety lever on both ends of the trigger bar. And when you pull a trigger, it pulls the safety lever up. When you release the trigger, it pushes it down, and it uses the tension on the trigger bar spring to do the full action. And then if you look at the pre-upgrade version, you pull the trigger and it goes up, and you release the trigger and nothing happens because the spring isn't obviously in place. And if you look, it only interacts at the front of the trigger bar. There is no interaction at the rear. So The question I ask is, why did they make this change? Because it doesn't seem to be a safety related thing. So I came to the conclusion that it must just be a better design and engineering thing, or perhaps they made the change to remove the spring and therefore offset the cost of adding the trigger bar disconnector, or maybe for both reasons. I don't know. But I don't think it really matters, because if you've ever had to reassemble the pre-upgrade FCU and therefore you had to fiddle with a tiny spring, and that spring requires you to have not only the safety lever in place, but also the SEAR spring, the pins, everything that holds the assembly in place so you can press fit this spring, then you come to realize that this makes for a much improved user experience. Anyways, let's move on. I want to talk about the SEAR, and there are a couple of notable changes to the upgraded SEAR that the pre-upgrade didn't have. Now, probably the most commonly mentioned one is the fact that they've added this secondary ledge, and the concept being that should this first main ledge have a critical malfunction, or the striker walked itself off that ledge or jumped over that ledge somehow, the secondary ledge would catch the striker and prevent it from just springing directly into the breech face. And if you've watched the video on P320 safety mechanisms on SIG Mechanics, I go into a lot of detail on this. But I also want to talk about some of the other changes that they made. The upgraded P320 underwent some additional lightening of the SEAR by milling out this new skeletonized geometry, whereas the pre-upgraded SEAR weighs in at about 0.10 ounces. The upgraded one weighs 0.05. That's a 50% reduction in weight. And likely a change was made to assist the drop safety by the reduction of inertia caused by movement. They both obviously still do the same job, but look at how this ledge over here, running along the leg of the SEAR, now interacts with the takedown safety lever bar. If you've watched some of the other videos on SIG Mechanics, you know that the takedown safety lever bar has a leg, and that leg goes into and interacts with the SEAR inside the SEAR housing. And on the pre-upgrade version of the SEAR, you note that the geometry cut out into the SEAR is much more boxy, or has a much straighter lines than the current comparison, where this SEAR has a geometry that has a much smoother face, or a ledge that interacts with the takedown safety lever bar. And what I find that does is the boxy design calls for a much harder snap down, whereas on this geometry cutout, it's a much smoother transition when the takedown safety lever bar is engaged. And this is likely just the cause of milling out as much material as possible, but it's an interesting effect nonetheless. Let's move on. Now, the last thing I wanted to point out on the SEAR was the noticeable change SIG made to the ledge depth or height. And I want to talk about the ledge on the SEAR. I'm talking about this vertical plane that you see at the back end of both of these SEARs. Now, on the pre-upgrade model, that height of that ledge is 0.088 inches. On the upgraded SEAR, it's reduced down to 0.058 inches. And what that seems to have done is the striker's leg now interacts with and touches the base or face of the SEAR at all times. Comparatively, on the pre-upgrade model, there is a gap between the base of the striker and the SEAR itself of 0.04 inches. And it might seem to some people as counterintuitive to make it so that the striker's face has less of a distance to travel upwards before firing. But if you look closely, the striker dimensions haven't changed at all. The only thing that they seem to have changed was the SEAR's ledge depth. They seem to just tighten the tolerance between the two on the upgraded version. The striker's face doesn't travel upwards any more than it previously did, so if I pull the triggers, it won't make a noticeable difference. I'll reserve my opinion on the theory as to why they did something like that, but I can say that restricting movement seems to be a key intention. Let's keep going. Let's talk about the trigger, and this is going to be rather short because, well, it's a trigger and nobody needs me to explain a trigger to them. But for SIG Sauer, this was actually the most significant upgrade that they did as part of the voluntary upgrade program to consumer P320s. And that was reducing the weight from this heavier trigger on the pre-upgrade to a lightened version. Where the heavier trigger has a weight of 0.55 ounces, the lightened trigger now reads at 0.35 ounces. And that's a 36% reduction in weight to the trigger. If you don't know why this was one of the most important changes, that's because according to SIG Sauer, this one came as part of additional testing done after the pre-upgrade P320, which by the way passed or exceeded all known testing requirements at that time, was found to discharge after repeated drops at a height of 1.5 meters, while also at a very specific angle of -30 degrees and onto concrete or hard surfaces. The reduction of weight in the trigger would serve to prevent the trigger from being pulled by inertia once the gun impacts the ground at that specific angle. So if you've heard the Newton's law of motion, an object in motion stays in motion, here's where that applies. Of course, I won't be doing a drop test here, or at least not an official one today, but there are other videos out there as well as documents from SIG Sauer themselves to support this whole claim. And I could probably add more to this, but it won't be from my own testing, and I prefer in this case to educate rather than speculate. But I will mention one thing. SIG's result from testing their pre-upgrade P320s resulted in them finding that by only reducing the trigger weight, that -30-degree drop problem got resolved. And if that is the case, it seems that the upgrade program goes far beyond what they require to do to fix the problem. The last upgrade I want to talk about is the striker. And here we have the pre-upgrade and post-upgrade striker side by side, and we can see that the post-upgrade striker, the upgraded striker, has undergone this lightening procedure along the shaft of the striker. Whereas the pre-upgrade model used to weigh in at 0.265 ounces. The upgraded one now comes in at 0.206 ounces. That's about a 25% reduction in weight by having the lightning cuts put into the body. But I've also noticed some other interesting bits of information as I inspected both of these strikers. There are some changes that were made both aesthetically and function-wise to the safety lever, or the striker's safety lever. Let's take a closer look at that. Starting with the most obvious, the pre-upgrade striker safety lever definitely had more of an aesthetic appeal to it. In comparison to the upgraded model, which is just a plain stamped part. But they've also made some significant changes to the new design that helps the end user, and that was found here at the rear end. It used to have this circular tab, and now they've changed it to the semicircular tab, and it used to have a much more profound profile, which now the slope is a lot more gradual. And for good reason they made this change, because if you've ever tried to reassemble the pre-upgrade striker, you'll know that at the rear end, this little hole here is where this tab sits, and at best it sits loosely. Because once you start dealing with the spring or introducing the spring to the assembly, like I did here, when you touch the lever, the whole assembly seems to just fall apart. So a user has to be a little bit more conscious of this as they're working on it. However, the new design has an improved profile where at the back they've made or machined some sort of pocket. And what happens here is the safety lever sits inside that pocket before you drop it into its place. And it already on its own sits very well, but if you put in the the spring and you can actually play with it now, you see that it doesn't fall apart. And like I've mentioned on some other changes that I've seen throughout the upgraded P320, this doesn't seem like it was a safety feature or improvement that they've made. They only seem to have improved the engineering of it in general. Last, just for the sake of providing SIGmechanic viewers with a comprehensive and complete comparison of pre and post upgrade, I asked MD Charlton if there are any differences to the receivers themselves. And it turns out that there is, but the list is kind of short. First, and most obvious, is that they removed this tab at the rear right side of the receiver for installing the disconnector. Although there is still a question as to what that tab actually did, when I inspected the complete pistol assembly, I can only venture a guess that it used to provide some additional stability to the slide to somewhat help or mitigate slide movement. You can check out this video here for more detail on the slide moving. And second is a lesser known change to the right side of the receiver, where they relieve this area here, with the idea that a new trigger bar would now have added clearance when installed. And all of this gets done by CNC machining, therefore SIG is able to keep this consistent, and all upgraded receivers will be returned to their owners with the same final specs. Thank you for watching the video, and I hope you learned something new today. As I always say about this community, the firearms community is invaluable to the education of others within our careers and hobbies. So make sure to welcome and educate others about their guns so that they may be more comfortable with their guns and therefore get more enjoyment from the experience. Remember to subscribe to the SIGmechanics channel for more content and to know when new videos are released. And before I go, another big thank you to MD Charlton for supplying me with all the hard to acquire pre-upgrade parts so I can make this video. I look forward to all the great work we're going to do together. That's it, guys. I'll see you soon.